Hello. Today let us talk about perhaps the most famous, most promising, and also one of the most complex machine learning models, artificial neural networks. Perhaps the most powerful and now widespread example of machine learning approaches are artificial neural networks. They draw inspiration from the biological observations of how the actual brain of living species work, transmitting electrical signals within an interconnected network of neurons. The approach tries to replicate this principle, implementing a computational scheme as a sequence of numeric signals being transmitted and processed by the network between the artificial neurons. However, the artificial neural networks are typically much simpler compared to their biological prototypes. And despite the initial inspiration, they are not even close to reproducing the actual brain function of even the simplest living species, not to mention human brain. Nevertheless, they provide powerful and very flexible model capable of learning arbitrary complex computational schemes. The most common architecture of the artificial neural network is layered. Its first layer serves as an input layer, being initialized with the input data. The layer contains a set of artificial neurons, each corresponding to one of the input variables and being assigned its value. Then, those values are transmitted to the neurons of the next layer, called the first hidden layer. It's called hidden because it plays an intermediate role, and its functioning is not directly observed in the output of the network, although influences it, of course. Each input neuron might be connected to multiple neurons or often to every neuron of the first hidden layer. Such a layer is called fully connected. This way, the neurons of the first hidden layer receive inputs from multiple input neurons, process them, and generate the outputs. Those outputs are further transmitted to the second hidden layer of the network. They are in turn processed by the neurons of the second hidden layer and transferred further. The network might have multiple hidden layers. In this case, it's called a deep neural network. The more hidden layers, the deeper is the architecture. Or it can have just a few hidden layers. In this case, we can call it a shallow network. In the end, the last hidden layer transfers the outputs of the neurons to the output layer. The output layer can have one or multiple neurons depending on the number of the output variables of the model. This way, the network takes the values of the input variables and applies a sequence of transformations implemented by its individual neurons to generate the final output. A number of neurons and the layers, if large enough, can implement computational schemes of arbitrary complexity. With that, each individual neuron is fairly simple. It receives multiple inputs from the outputs of the neurons of the previous layer is connected to, scales them using the certain weight coefficients, and then summarizes the scaled inputs and passes it to so-called activation function, adding possibly a constant coefficient. The result, also called activation, serves as an output of the neuron. This way, the neuron simply works as a superposition of a weighted linear combination of the inputs and a certain nonlinear function similar to the generalized linear regression framework. The commonly used activation function is a sigmoid function, the one we already encountered in the logistic regression. It possesses a useful property of keeping the output within a bounded range between 0 and 1 for any scale of the inputs. This is particularly helpful if the desired output should represent a probability. This, however, comes not without drawbacks, one of which is having very low values of the derivative over the large ranges of the input values, which creates a challenge for the gradient descent methods commonly used to train the artificial neural network models. There are other activation functions which one can use as an alternative. As it often happens in computer science, there's no universal solution here. Different activation functions turn out to be helpful for different types of networks and different types of tasks. The choice of an activation function is part of the network configuration. With that, the weight parameters and the constant are the parameters the model needs to learn during the training phase. We'll talk about the ways to train the neural network later. In short, we have a supervised learning problem where the network needs to learn dependency between given inputs and the observed outputs. The parameters of all the neurons are often learned using gradient descent numeric optimization and so-called backpropagation approach to compute the gradient. And the objective of this optimization is minimizing the errors between the generated and expected outputs. Although each neuron is fairly simple, it is the number of the neurons and connections between them that make the resulting model as complex as one needs, being capable of learning any functional dependency of arbitrary complexity. And nowadays, we know many specific types of neural network architectures: convolutional and recurrent neural networks, autoencoders, transformers, graph neural networks. But those we can already discuss in separate videos. Stay tuned.